From the iconic, genre-creating Dragon Quest to Quintet's ambitious Heaven and Earth trilogy, RPG favorites such as the Star Ocean series and Valkyrie Profile,
To my side, my noble Einherjar.
and all of the super obscure releases in between that never saw the light of day outside of Japan, Enix as a company certainly leaves quite the legacy behind it. While a lot of people may just know them as Square Enix today, if you grew up playing RPGs in the 90s, there was a pretty good chance you were very familiar with Enix. I mean, the fact that they were the ones responsible for publishing the first JRPG ever created should say enough right there. With that said, in terms of Western popularity at least, Enix always kinda lived in Squaresoft's shadow, much how Dragon Quest in general lived in Final Fantasy's shadow. I know this was very different in Japan, but America, not so much. It definitely didn't help that we didn't even get a single Dragon Quest game for the Super Nintendo localized in English. Meanwhile, Squaresoft was already blowing people's minds with games like Final Fantasy 4 and 6, otherwise known as 2 and 3 in North America at the time, and that's not even to mention other classics like Chrono Trigger and Super Mario RPG. Don't get me wrong, Enix did have some presence here with games like Soul Blazer and Illusion of Gaia. They just never saw the same mainstream popularity as some of Squaresoft's best, and this would only be exemplified on the PlayStation with the release of Final Fantasy VII. I mean, that one literally changed the game when it came out in the West, but when Dragon Warrior 7 came out though, it flew entirely under the radar and pretty much no one cared. And yes, this was a time when Dragon Quest was still referred to as Dragon Warrior in the West. Despite all that, Dragon Quest, and therefore Enix, remained extremely popular in Japan. So much even that after the release of Dragon Quest III, the police had to ask Enix to start releasing them on the weekends as too many kids were skipping school to play them. Pretty crazy stuff, right? So yeah, while Enix may not have gotten the recognition it deserved in the West back then, they've always been revered in Japan and treated as the kings and queens that they are. This video was gonna aim to show just what made Enix so damn special. It won't be a comprehensive look of their entire history, but it will be a comprehensive look of every game they released in the 90s, and not just RPGs this time either. This is basically a follow-up to our video about Squaresoft in the 90s, which ended up doing way better than we could have ever imagined. Thank you guys so much for that one. In that video though, we only talked about their RPGs, so for this one, we wanted to switch it up and go all out. So, grab some snacks, make yourself comfy, just do whatever you gotta do, cause we're gonna be here for a while. Let's just go ahead and take a nostalgic look back at Enix in the 90s. The first game Enix released in the 90s was Dragon Quest IV on February 11th, 1990 for the original Nintendo. Also, like our Squaresoft video, I'm only going to mention their Japanese release dates to save a little time. Dragon Quest IV was developed by Chunsoft and was the first game in the Zenithian trilogy. And on that note, I should probably clarify something real quick. Unlike Squaresoft, Enix was a publisher only and worked with a variety of teams to develop their games. They just simply helped publish and release them. Given all the different developers, this of course means that a lot of the games have vastly different aesthetic and design choices between them. It's gonna make this quite the video. Anyway, Dragon Quest IV was a pretty unique entry for multiple reasons. Like I briefly mentioned a bit ago, Dragon Quest IV was the first game in the Zenithian trilogy and took place in a different universe than the first three games, which are known as the Erdrick trilogy. However, definitely the most unique part about it was how it was structured. The game is split up into 5 chapters, with the player controlling a different character, or set of characters, in each one. In fact, you don't even get to control the main protagonist of the game until the last chapter, where you then go and recruit all of the characters you played as in the previous chapters. It's a pretty cool system overall, and in hindsight, was kind of a bold choice by the developers to switch it up. It allowed the player to connect with the characters a little bit more, learning a little bit about their backstories, instead of just being a completely random person joining you out of nowhere that you know nothing about. In a lot of ways, Dragon Quest IV was really ahead of its time actually. It's a shame the game never got the popularity it deserved in the West at the time, as it came out more than 2.5 years after its Japanese release, pretty well into the Super Nintendo's lifespan by that point. Fortunately, we would get a remaster for the DS much later on, and that one's pretty damn good. ActRaiser was developed by Quintet and came out on December 16, 1990 for the Super Nintendo. It was actually the first game that Quintet created and would be the start of a very successful relationship between them and Enix. ActRaiser was a combination of a 2D action platformer mixed with a town simulation builder and is one of the most unique games I've ever played. Sort of think Castlevania mixed with SimCity, but instead of a city, you're trying to lead a civilization towards prosperity. Yeah, pretty damn cool. The simulation aspect is complex enough to be deep and engaging, without being needlessly convoluted and confusing. They really hit a nice balance here, I think. The 2D action parts aren't really groundbreaking, but are still pretty fun and get the job done. It's the gameplay loop between these two aspects that make it so great. The music is also incredible and a real highlight of the game. Overall, it's just an incredibly fun little title. I remember playing it for the first time back in high school and beating it in a single weekend as I couldn't put it down. Good times. After the uneventful year of 1991 with no releases, Soul Blazer would come out for the Super Nintendo on January 31st, 1992. It was another Quintet developed game and was the first title in their Heaven and Earth trilogy. You play as a titular Blazer who sent down to Earth from the heavens by the Master to restore and save the Friel Kingdom from the evil Death Toll. By the way, the Master is the same godlike being you play as in ActRaiser. That's not the only thing it has in common with that game either. Thematically, there's a lot of similarities with the whole creation aspect. Combat and exploration plays out like your typical top-down action RPG. However, when you destroy monster lairs and dungeons, you free a soul which then goes back to help reconstruct the town and the surrounding area. The souls can range from humans to animals to flowers and stuff like that. As you liberate more souls, the town gradually restores itself to its former glory, opening up shops and all sorts of typical town things. After you completely restore a town and defeat the boss of the area, you move on to the next town and dungeon area and do it again. For those that have played the PS2 RPG, Dark Cloud, I think it's pretty safe to say that this game heavily inspired that one. Soul Blazer also came with a pretty cool poster that on the back of it shows a list of key items, the various areas you'll visit, and the bosses of said areas. I always loved it when games included extra little goodies like this. Overall, this was just a super fun game and a promising sign from Quintet for more great things to come.
Dragon Quest すごいドラゴンクエストできました。愛が冒険が人生がドラゴンクエスト5天空の花嫁 Enix.
On September 27th, 1992, Dragon Quest V would be released for the Super Famicom. And yes, specifically the Super Famicom and not the Super Nintendo, as this would be the first Dragon Quest game to not see a release outside of Japan. Well, until the DS remake many years later, that is. It's a real shame, as Dragon Quest V is a phenomenal game and considered by many to be the best entry in the series. I mean, hell, it's the only game in the series to get a full-on movie adaptation even. Chunsoft really knocked it out of the park with this one. Now, just what makes it so damn good? Well, a lot of reasons actually. For one, it had the most emotional and character-driven story in the series up until that point. It follows the protagonist from childhood to adulthood in roughly 30 years of his life, and this of course means you experience very significant life events along the way. You even get to choose a partner in marriage, have kids with them, and then those kids will join your party and fight with you later on, in addition to your wife too. What other RPG do you know that lets you kick ass as an entire family? Not only was that super unique for the time, but it still is even now. Another unique thing this game did was the whole monster companion system. Select monsters could join your party after defeating them in battle based on a variety of factors. This kinda gave the game a Shin Megami Tensei / Pokemon aspect before Pokemon was even a thing. Overall, Dragon Quest V was just a super amazing title with some original design choices. It's not hard to see why it's such a fan favorite. Also, could we just take this moment to appreciate how insanely cool the Super Famicom box art is? I'm a huge fan of Toriyama's art style, and this is like a perfect representation of it. It's just so imaginative and adventurous looking. I love it. There's so much detail, and it's a great example of how much heart and effort companies actually put into their box art back in the day, as opposed to the low effort, generic stuff that we often get now. Man, what a shame. On December 15th, 1992, the Game Boy title Dungeon Land would come out in Japan. This is going to be the first of many really obscure titles that a lot of you probably haven't heard of. This video started off with some heavy hitters, but damn, the second part is going to look a lot different in terms of notability when we get there. You guys are in for some weird games. Anyway, Dungeon Land was developed by Random House and seems to be kind of like a role-playing board game of sorts. There's not a whole lot of information on this game out there, so it remains pretty obscure. On that same exact day, Random House would also release Just Breed for the Famicom. God, I just love this box art. 90s video game box art anime-like aesthetic just speaks to my soul. This one wouldn't see an official English release either, but it would see a fan translation online in the early 2000s. Despite the, rather odd title, Just Breed was a tactical RPG in the vein of games like Fire Emblem and Shining Force, though Shining Force would be a better example considering you do get to walk around and explore towns in between battles. For those that are always asking for games similar to Shining Force with the traditional JRPG exploration combined with strategy RPG combat, here you guys go. Being that it is a Famicom game, it's not quite as polished or as big on story, but it's still pretty good. What's cool about this game is that there's actually 6 different main characters, and when in battle, those characters lead their own individual armies filled with 6 different units and classes. There's definitely some good strategy to be had here if you like this type of combat. Being that it did come out towards the end of the Famicom's lifespan, it's also one of the only games on the system to make use of the MMC5 chip, which improved the game's graphics and sounds. 1 week later, on December 21st, the cult classic, Evo Search for Eden, would be released for the Super Nintendo. The game was developed by Almanac Corporation and was largely based on their PC 9801 home computer Japanese exclusive, 4.6 billion year story, The Theory of Evolution. Yeah, that's just a translated title. The original Japanese one is a little bit too complex for me to pronounce. Evo, Search for Eden, was directed by Takashi Yoneda, who also happened to be the lead designer of Quintet's ActRaiser, so right off the bat, you knew you were in good hands. It's an extremely unique game, and there's really not another out there like it on the system, or for any system for that matter, really. Basically, you play as an organism over billions of years in different geological periods as you try to evolve into the best life form so you can enter the Garden of Eden and marry the personification of Earth itself, Gaia. Yeah, pretty original stuff. Gameplay-wise, it plays out like a side-scroller where you consume enemies to level up and evolve. You can choose to evolve specific parts of your body into a variety of forms, which all have their own gameplay strengths as well, giving this game a lot of replayability. The OST is also incredible and considered by many to be one of the best on the console. While Evo may not be a game for everyone, the excessive grinding certainly doesn't help. For the people it does appeal to, they're bound to really love this one. It's worth playing alone just to see how creatively ambitious it was for the time. Just, good luck getting a physical copy these days. It's one of the most expensive games on the system and fetches for quite the pretty penny. I never owned this one growing up, and looking at the current prices, I probably never will. Such is life. On April 23rd, 1993, the 7th Saga would come out for the Super Nintendo. Well, technically, it was called Elnard at the time, as it wouldn't see the 7th Saga name until the North American release. It was developed by Produce, and damn, is it one hard-ass game. The 7th Saga version at least, not necessarily Elnard. For whatever reason, they decided to massively ramp up the difficulty for the North American release, both boosting enemy stats and reducing the stat bonuses you receive upon leveling up. Because of this, it's widely known as the hardest Super Nintendo RPG, and one that I'm sure a lot of players gave up on. It's quite a shame, really, as there's a lot of things to love about the actual game. At the start of the game, you have to choose one of 7 characters, and whatever characters you don't choose can be encountered throughout the game, where they'll either fight against you or join your party. And in some cases, they'll even join you just to betray you and fight you later on. This aspect alone gives the game a ton of replayability, as no one playthrough is the same. Some other notable features about this game are the really cool enemy battle sprites, and the radar on the world map that shows you where enemies are at, which helps you avoid fights to a certain degree. All in all, while there's some great and unique mechanics here, this is probably a game only recommended for the most hardcore of RPG players. You really gotta love the grind, literally and figuratively.
この国はこのままでは滅びてしまう。さあ、立ち上がるのは今、民衆と共に。迫力の戦闘シーン、君だけのマルチストーリー、かつてないリアルタイムシミュレーション、伝説のオーガバトル、スーパーファミコンで新発売。
1 month later, on May 15th, Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen would be released for the Super Nintendo. It was developed by Quest and was the first game in their Ogre Battle series, which is in desperate need of a revival these days. This real-time, tactical RPG was also directed by Yasumi Matsuno, who would later go on to direct other timeless classics such as Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story, for example. Yeah, this dude kicks ass. I feel like I keep saying unique a lot in this video, but the gameplay here really is just unique, and I don't know how else to describe it. Basically, you command battalions comprised of individual units, where you send them out to battle other enemy battalions, along with capturing enemy strongholds. There's a lot of different classes in this game, giving you a ton of options to mold your parties how you see fit. Another huge standout in this game is the story. There's a moral alignment system which affects the way the story branches off into, allowing for 13 possible endings. Again, I sound like a broken record, but as one could imagine, this of course gives the game a lot of replayability. But yeah, March of the Black Queen was just a real solid game, and a real pioneer in the genre. Taking it back to something more obscure, Jute Senki, or Chronicles of the Tree Emperor, would be released on August 27th for the Super Nintendo. This one was developed by Tamtam and never saw an English release. First of all, I just gotta say, I love the art for this game. Just look at how cool some of these mechs are. I get mad Xenogears vibes, it's awesome. Outside of the cool mecha and nature-like aesthetic, this game played out like a pretty standard tactical RPG where you had to capture enemy bases to win fights. There's some pretty sweet battle animations to go along with it too. A couple months later in October, Paladin's Quest would come out for the Super Nintendo. In North America, that is. The game would actually be released in Japan under the title Linus Memories of an Ancient Machine the year prior. It was just published by Asmik Corporation in Japan and not Enix, which is why it's listed here. I have no idea why they decided to localize it as Paladin's Quest though, as it's such an inaccurate representation of what the game's actually about. There's no paladin in this game, at all. In fact, it doesn't even take place during medieval times. It's sorta like a weird mixture of sci-fi and fantasy with some otherworldly set pieces thrown in there. It would be like if they localized Dragon Quest as Pirate Adventure or Samurai Journey or whatever. It just makes no sense. Based on the name, a lot of people probably just thought it was gonna be a super generic fantasy title, but really, it couldn't be anything further from that. There's no other RPG on the system with this type of environmental design and interesting color palette. All the original, distinct locations and pastel colors give this game a really different feel compared to its peers. If you're someone who plays games for the atmosphere, then this one is worth checking out for that reason alone. As an actual game, it's not bad. The story is interesting, there's some funny, quirky humor, and some gameplay mechanics are pretty unique. Magic in battle uses HP instead of MP, and the party system allows you to recruit various mercenaries along your journey. Overall, this is a really interesting, fun little game that probably got overlooked back in the day due to its generic title. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be the last poor decision that Enix of America would make when publishing games in the West. Later that month, on October 29th, ActRaiser 2 would come out for the Super Nintendo. This was naturally a follow-up to the huge sleeper hit that was the original, so one could expect more of the same, just bigger and better, right? Wrong. Very, very wrong. For this sequel, they completely ditched the town-building mechanic that made the first one so unique and memorable. Instead, the entire game is just a 2D action side-scrolling platformer. Apparently, Enix had specific directions for Quinset and told them to get rid of the city simulation aspect. They thought that part was a little too complex and that people just wanted action only. Oh, in hindsight, how wrong they were. It's actually not a bad game, it just wasn't what the fans wanted, so it created a lot of disappointment. Judging it as its own thing though, there's some great things here. Visually, the game looks amazing and is one of the best looking games on the entire system. It also sounds pretty good too. Actual gameplay wise, this game's pretty damn hard. It's notorious for being one of the most difficult games on the SNES, and it's not hard to see why. Enemies move fast and you move slow. You really have to be calculated and deliberate here if you want to see success. You can't just rush through levels trying to slash everything in your path. You're gonna get wrecked. This game rewards patient players that have a knack for challenge, so if that sounds like you, then this one may be worth looking into. The next month, on November 27th, the second game in Quinset's Heaven and Earth trilogy, Illusion of Gaia, would be released for the Super Nintendo. Despite this game being a part of the same trilogy as Soul Blazer, it's really just because of the thematic and gameplay similarities and not anything to do with the plot. Well, there are some loose connections and references, I guess, but nothing that important to understand the story. In this game, you play as Will, an explorer who's fated with the task of saving the world from an incoming comet. That's just the very basic premise, as it gets much more complex than that. Overall, the plot balances an interesting juxtaposition between some more quirky, random humor at times, mixed with more emotional storytelling. The setting is also quite original and has you traveling to real-world locations such as the Great Wall of China and ancient Egypt. Gameplay-wise, there is no creation aspect in this one like there was in Soul Blazer, but the top-down action RPG gameplay returns, more polished than ever. What makes this one stand out though, is how you can switch between two other characters with their own playstyles. That, combined with the range of movements and actions you have at your disposal, give this one a lot of variety in the gameplay department. When you combine this even further with the pretty visuals, awesome OST, and great dungeon design, you have a very solid game in Illusion of Gaia.
知られるサウンド、グラフィック、すべてがスーパーファミコンでパワーアップ。目を開けて夢を見よ。ドラゴンクエスト1、12月18日新発売。Enix。
A month later, on December 18th, remakes of the first two Dragon Quest games would come out for the Super Nintendo. These are widely considered the best versions of the games as they have some obvious graphical improvements, along with some more player-friendly gameplay design choices. I'm not gonna go into these too much considering they came out in the 80s originally, and to properly talk about the first game I would need to go into the series history a bit, which would be a long enough video on its own. We do plan on eventually making a complete series retrospective over Dragon Quest though, so I'm just gonna wait till that one to go into more detail about it all. Moving on to 1994, Brainlord would be released on January 29th for the Super Nintendo. Brainlord was an action RPG developed by Produce, the same people behind the 7th Saga. What you see here is pretty much what you get. It plays out like your standard top-down action game, similar to titles like Soul Blazer and Link to the Past. There's a lot of weapon variety here and movement feels pretty good overall. You can also jump too, so that's pretty cool. With that said, it's not just straight action either. It's a very puzzle-heavy game, so be prepared to deal with those a lot in dungeons. Story-wise, it's a bit more lighthearted than the title might suggest, which I always thought was kinda random. Definitely not the first title that would come to mind when playing this game. But yeah, Brainlord's a pretty fun game overall. In my opinion, it's not like a top-tier Super Nintendo RPG, but it's above average. A month later, on February 26th, Itadaki Street 2 would come out for the Super Nintendo, or Super Famicom I should say, as it never had an English release. It was developed by Tomcat System and seems to be like a party board game of sorts. I'm not gonna go into this one too much, but I do gotta say, I really love the graphics here. They're just super charming, I think. On March 25th, Nankoku Shonen Papua-kun would come out for both the Super Famicom and Game Boy. Yeah, I know I completely butchered that name, so my apologies there. The Game Boy version just looks okay, so I'm only gonna talk about the Super Famicom one here. Both were developed by Daft though, a studio that I can't really find much about. These are also based on a manga published by Enix that would later see an anime adaptation as well. It's a surprisingly polished platformer with a lot of great things going for it. Graphics look good, controls are responsive, and there's some cool RPG-like elements that give a little depth to the gameplay. As one could imagine, this never officially got released in the West, but there is an English fan translation online and it's well worth playing. Not that you even need it really, as it's pretty light on text, so you could probably play it without it anyway. It's just a pretty fun game overall and probably one of the better Super Famicom games to never make it out of Japan. On July 8th of that year, Robotrek would come out for the Super Nintendo, or as it was known in Japan, Slapstick. Yeah, the Japanese title makes it sound like you're in for a comedic, light-hearted adventure, and you're not wrong to think that. They really tried hard to make this one seem a lot more serious than what it was in the West, what with the name change and the Death Star looking like thing on the box art, but yeah, that's not the case here. This one was co-developed by Quintet, who you should be very familiar with by now, and Ancient, the same team behind the Oasis series of games. It's a very colorful, Saturday morning, cartoonish type RPG where you customize robots and send them out into battles. You really get a lot of options to customize your robots with, and it's so much fun to experiment around with all the different combinations. So many options even that it may seem a little overwhelming to some, so I'm sure that's why they decided to include this helpful guide with the game. Combat plays out like a mix of both turn-based and action RPGs, and probably even inspired Pokemon in some ways, with the whole sending out robots to fight for you thing, and leaving them in capsules between battles. While it may have inspired Pokemon there, it took inspiration from Mario in other aspects, like with the overworld exploration for example. It's so charming, I love it. All in all, Robotrek's a pretty underlooked game that offers a fun and creative experience. With its vibrant graphics and whimsical music, few Super Nintendo RPGs give off a similar vibe as this one. On December 9th, Wonder Project J would be released for the Super Famicom. It was developed by Almanac Corporation, the same team behind Evo Search for Eden. This is an extremely unique and different type of simulation game, of which no other kind on the system exists. Essentially, you're raising a mechanical boy and trying to help show them what it means to be human. Yeah, it's pretty much just anime Pinocchio with gameplay built around it. You can't control the boy directly, but you do have to try to influence him to do the right thing, much like a parent. If he does something right, you praise him. If he does something wrong, well, you do the opposite of that. Through all of this and other mechanics, you'll build the boy's plethora of stats which will allow him to progress forward through the game. As I'm sure you've noticed, this game looks absolutely stunning and pushed the console to its limits. The Studio Ghibli-esque and Astro Boy-inspired art style just holds up marvelously and is so damn gorgeous. Sprites are animated well and the backgrounds are so detailed and vibrant. Based on how bright and colorful the graphics are, you might just think this is a pretty kiddie game, right? Surprisingly, no, the story gets pretty mature at times and deals with heavier themes such as racism and bigotry. Due to the really different nature of the game, this one never saw an English release, but a fan translation does exist online. Despite that though, interestingly enough, this game sold extremely well in Japan. Outside of Dragon Quest, it's the best-selling Super Famicom game in this entire video, and is a top 40 selling game for the system overall. Yeah, pretty wondrous stuff for Wonder Project J. The next year, in 1995, Neketsu Tairiku Burning Heroes would be released for the Super Famicom in Japan. I believe this translates to Hot-Blooded Continent Burning Heroes in English, but it never got released over here. There is a fan translation online though. This is a pretty interesting turn-based RPG developed by J-Force, where you play as 8 different protagonists in their own scenario. I wouldn't say this one is a real standout personally, but if you've already played a lot of other Super Nintendo RPGs and are itching for some more, then it might be worth checking out. 1 month later, on April 21st, Mahojin Guru Guru would come out for the Super Famicom. It was developed by Tam and was based on an anime and manga of the same name, also published by Enix. It's a cute, lighthearted RPG, and that's really all I know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think this one's been translated to English yet. I do like the graphics though. The next month, on May 25th, King Arthur and the Knights of Justice would be released for the Super Nintendo. It was an action-adventure game developed by Manley & Associates, and unlike every other game on this list, it only came out in North America and not Japan. It's based on a Saturday morning cartoon of the same name that follows the cleverly named Arthur King and his football team, the Knights, as they get transported back to medieval times, become the Knights of Justice, and must save King Arthur. Yeah, it's one of those stories. As far as the game itself, it's not great. In all honesty, maybe the worst game in this video so far, in my opinion at least. It's just not polished very well and has some questionable game design choices. Like, look at this map they included with the game. Oh wow, super helpful. Thanks for letting me know that each town is called town and each castle is called castle with no way to differentiate them from one another. This is about as useful as flipping through Netflix and all the shows being called show and movies being called movie. Some of you might be asking, well, if this game's so shitty, then why do you even have a full complete copy of it? Well, my brother, / the editor of this channel for those that don't know, was lucky enough to find a complete copy of this game and a bunch of other Super Nintendo RPGs at a pawn shop back in high school for like $5 a piece. Yeah, it was one of those rare jackpot situations that you always hear about that just probably wouldn't happen today. It's where we got all the Quintet games you see in this video, along with other RPGs like the Twisted Tales of Spike McFang, Equinox, Arcana, yeah, stuff like that. Definitely a legendary haul. Anyone else get lucky with situations like that back in the past? Let us know in the comments below. On July 14th of that year, Mystic Arc would come out for the Super Famicom. This one was developed by Produce and is kind of like a spiritual successor to the 7th Saga. I mean, look at the battle graphics, they're pretty much the same and just as cool as ever. Unfortunately though, this one never made it out of Japan, but a fan translation does exist online as one would expect. While this one does have some interesting gameplay mechanics, like being able to choose between a male and female at the start and the whole arc system, it's a bit more by the numbers than the 7th Saga and not quite as open-ended. It's also not nearly as difficult either, so there's that. The radar on the world map that lets you see where enemies are at makes its return too, so that's pretty cool. All in all, it's an above-average Super Famicom RPG. On September 29th, Joshu Mahong Tenpai would come out for the Super Famicom. Yeah, this is just Mahong in video game form. There's no need to talk about it further. On that same day, a more exciting game by the name of Violinist of Hamelin would be released on the Super Famicom. This one was developed by Daft and was based on an anime and manga of the same name that was, yep, you guessed it, published by Enix. It's a really fun puzzle platformer with colorful graphics, great music, and tons of charm. In addition to controlling the main character Hamel, there's a side character by the name of Flute who you can throw at enemies and collect costumes for, allowing them to transform into various animals that you can then utilize to progress forward through the level. Level designs are worked around these costumes too, so gameplay stays pretty engaging. Honestly, this is a really quality, polished title that is absolutely a hidden gem. It never got released in the West, but a fan translation does exist online, so if you want some puzzle, platforming greatness, check this one out. On October 20th, Quintet's legendary Terranigma would be released for the Super Famicom. This was the last game in their Heaven and Earth trilogy, and god, is it an absolute classic. It's right there in the conversation with games like Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI when talking about the console's best RPGs. Sadly, to us Americans, it never got released over here and only came out in Japan and Europe. As a kid, this always caused me to look at it as like the lost holy grail of RPGs, or the one that got away. I would read all these things on message boards like game FAQs about how amazing it was, so it just made me sad that I couldn't play it. Then I discovered something that rhymes with simulation, and the rest was history. In this action RPG, you play as Ark, the teenage boy who's on a journey to resurrect the world and everything in it. The story is easily one of the best parts about this game, so I won't say anything more than that. It's one of those games it's best to go in blind and not know what you're in for. I will say though that the story gets really emotional at times and is gonna leave a lasting impression on you when you finish the game. For those wondering if you need to play Soul Blazer or Illusion of Gaia before this one, the answer is no. Again, they're more just connected by similar themes. Gameplay-wise, Terranigma is super polished and has the most dynamic combat in the trilogy. You have more attack options at your disposal than ever before, and even extra movement with the ability to climb up walls and stuff like that. As good as the story and combat is though, the music just might be the best aspect about this game. From top to bottom, the OST is filled with so many fantastic tracks, it's amazing. Hands down, one of the best OSTs on the entire system. And honestly, that statement could apply to the game as a whole. Terranigma is considered a classic in the genre for good reason, and it absolutely lives up to the hype. To finish the year off on December 9th, Dragon Quest VI would be released for the Super Famicom. Unlike all the other entries in the series, this one was not developed by Chunsoft, and was instead developed by Heartbeat. For being their first Dragon Quest game, how'd it go? Well, just okay. It's a solid RPG overall, but for Dragon Quest standards, it's often considered one of the weaker entries in the series. The class system made it a bit grindier than most, and it didn't really do a whole lot to innovate the series. With that said, Dragon Quest VI still has some really great aspects about it. The character design is awesome, and the visuals as a whole are really fantastic. Definitely a huge step up from number 5. I'm a big fan of the setting, the environments, and the exploration as well. The game truly makes you feel like you're embarking on an epic adventure. All in all, I think it's a great game and gets a little more flack than it should. I still wouldn't say it's one of the absolute best the series has to offer, but it's a really enjoyable and fun experience all around. The first game of 1996 would be Mahojin Guru Guru 2 on April 12th for the Super Famicom. Yep, this is obviously a sequel to the first game developed by the same company, Tam. Again, I don't know much about it as I don't think it was ever translated to English. Looks pretty charming though. The next month, on May 31st, Dark Half would be released for the Super Nintendo. This one was developed by West 1-Bit Entertainment, the same team behind the Wonder Boy series. Yeah, pretty radical departure from that, you could say. No cutesy, charming graphics here. This is a dark and mature game all the way through. What also makes Dark Half really interesting is how you can play as both the protagonist and the antagonist in this game. For fans of the whole Ryu and Fo-Lu dichotomy from Breath of Fire 4, this one's for you. The protagonist Falco scenario is pretty generic and by the numbers, but Ryukyu's storyline is where the game truly shines. He's basically a demon king from hell, and the game makes sure you know that very well. Dude doesn't hold back and kills a lot of innocent people in his storyline, and you see it all. His gameplay is also pretty unique, as in battle, he can recruit monsters to his side to fight his allies. The only shitty thing though is that you can't control these monsters in battle as they're only AI, and they're pretty stupid at that. On the flip side, Falco's party members are all fully controllable, it's just that his storyline isn't quite as interesting. So yeah, kind of a mixed bag in that regard. Unfortunately, Dark Half was never officially released in English, but a fan translation does exist online. Few 16-bit RPGs can match the dark tone and atmosphere of this game, making this one a pretty unique title in Enix's library. On July 19th, Star Ocean would come out for the Super Famicom. This is a long-running franchise by the company Tri-Ace that's still going on to this day. There might have been some pretty big gaps in between some releases, but still. A new entry was announced not that long ago, and I'm absolutely hyped. Anyway, about the first Star Ocean game. It's a gorgeous sci-fi fantasy RPG with a lot of original elements that make it stand out. First of all, on the development side, it's one of the only 2 games on the system to make use of the SDD1 chip, which allowed it to store a lot more data than a normal game. Speaking of development, a number of people behind another late Super Famicom RPG, Tales of Phantasia, left the Namco Wolf team after that game was released and formed the company Tri-Ace that you see here. That's why presentation-wise, these two have a lot in common together. Combat-wise though, they're quite different. Battles in Star Ocean are random, however when you're in the battle screen, battles are more action-based over a 3D plane. This gives combat a very unique feel and very different from any other Super Famicom RPG out there. What was also different was how there was voices in battle, which was pretty rare for the time. The plot in this game starts off with you trying to find a cure for a disease that turns people to stone, before you get wrapped up in an intergalactic space battle between warring federations. It's pretty interesting. For exploration, there is no overworld map unfortunately, as it's just interconnected areas, which I'm not too crazy about, but it is what it is. Town exploration is at least done really well though, due to the private action system. This is an optional mechanic that allows your party to split up when visiting a town, where you can see them going about their days, trigger hidden conversations, and even see some new relationships between your party members that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. When you combine this with the fact that Star Ocean also has optional characters that you can't recruit all in one playthrough, then it's easy to see why this one has so much replayability. It's just a really ambitious game chocked full of content, and that's not even getting into the super in-depth skill system. Unfortunately, due to the poor sales of their previous games and the Nintendo 64 just coming out, Enix had stopped publishing Super Nintendo games in America by this time, so this one never officially got released in the West, besides the later PSP and Switch remakes that is. With that said, this original version does have an English fan translation online though, so it's still fully playable and highly recommended.
たかしくんどうしたのたかしくんってば
俺帰るわ
なんだ
君は彼女をほっとけないワンダープロジェクト J264 で発売中
エニックス
A few months later, on November 22nd, Wonder Project J2 would be released for the Nintendo 64. Finally, we're switching up consoles. This is obviously a sequel to the first Wonder Project J, developed by the same team. Well, technically, by this time they had changed their name from Almanac Corporation to Givro Corporation. As one would expect, this is pretty much just more of the same, just bigger and prettier. It's one of the only 2D games on my console, and I think it looks awesome. The vibrant colors and Studio Ghibli-inspired aesthetic just pops so well and holds up amazingly. Instead of controlling a robot boy like you do in the first game, in this one you raise a robot girl by the name of Josette. She was also created by the same Dr. Geppetto from the first game, so yeah, this one is very much a direct sequel. Overall, it plays pretty similarly, just more fleshed out in some areas. I'm a big fan of how it switches up perspectives in this one. I think the first-person mode looks awesome. As you probably guessed, this one never officially got released in the West either. It was probably just a little too out there for American audiences at the time. It does have an English fan translation online though, so for those wanting to check it out, you're in luck. Also, I didn't know where else to put this part, but I did want to say that this game also came with its own controller pack, which I thought was pretty cool. The last game of 1996 was the Super Famicom Dragon Quest III Remake on December 6th. I'm not going to go into detail on this one either, considering the original version came out in the 80s, but I at least wanted to give it a mention. We'll save the in-depth discussion for our eventual Dragon Quest series retrospective. Quick shout out to the box art though. Again, Toriyama absolutely killed it here. Also, does that font look familiar to anyone? Well, if you've watched our channel before, it should, as it's the same one on our logo. I couldn't think where else to mention this, and it just seemed relevant given the topic of the video. So yeah, if it wasn't obvious enough how much we love Enix, that should be sufficient proof right there. 1997 was a pretty slow year as Enix would only publish 3 games this year, the first of which being one of my favorite games ever and Mischief Makers. This one was developed by Treasure and came out for the Nintendo 64 on June 26th. Hey, same day as my birthday, didn't know that. I should note though that Enix only published this in Japan and not in America. Nintendo took care of that over here. Man, where to begin with this one? I just have so many great memories of it as a kid. I remember getting stuck on a boss back in the day and having to call the hotline number on the back of the instruction manual and talking to some 40-year-old on the phone who tried to walk 10-year-old me through the boss. It was all staticky, I could barely hear anything, and considering he couldn't even see my screen, it was pretty much pointless. I'm sure my parents were real pleased about wasting $20 on a 2-minute phone call that didn't even help me. A product of its time, I guess, the 90s were certainly one time to be alive. Regarding the actual game, it's a 2D side-scrolling action platformer with a lot of unique elements. The whole shaking mechanic was just really original and provided so much variety in gameplay. Seriously, some levels play out so differently from one another, it would be impossible to explain it all here. Some are more puzzle-based, platforming-based, action-based. Hell, some levels you even play in a version of the Olympics. It's just a really creative game overall with vibrant, vivid colors and a super charming anime art style. Plot-wise, you play as the ultra-intergalactic Cybot G, Marina Lightyears, who's constantly trying to rescue the Professor Theo from the Imperial forces, along with protecting Planet Cancer from them in the process. One of my favorite aspects about this story were definitely the villains. Their voice acting is just pure 90s cheese in all the best ways. I still remember all of Lunar's stupid-ass lines. God, I love it. Their boss battles were all done really well too. There was a lot of creativity in both their human and mecha forms, which made no fight feel the same. Just super memorable all around. And that's really what I can say about the game overall as well. I could talk about this game forever, but I'm gonna end it here. Seriously though, play it if you haven't yet. It's a top tier treasure game, and if you know that company, you know that's saying a lot.
雨宮啓太監督作品アドベンチャー RPG 七つ風の島物語いよいよ発売風と名前と友達とセガサターン
On November 27th, Nanatsukaze no Shima Monogatari would be released for the Sega Saturn. I believe that translates to The Seven Blast of Winden Island Story. This game was developed by Givro Corporation, the same team behind Evo and the Wonder Project series, so right off the bat, you know you're in for something really unique. And unique this one definitely is. It's a stunningly gorgeous 2D adventure game where you play as a young chubby dragon by the name of Gapu. Honestly, this is one of the prettiest 2D games I've ever seen. The hand-drawn visuals look amazing, and I just love all of the lush colors and fantastical creatures. Again, I get mad Studio Ghibli vibes here. The art is so good in this game that they even included a second disc just filled with various artwork and character designs. The nature of the game is very slow-paced, and combined with pretty scenery and serene ambient music, it just creates this really relaxing atmosphere. The game is also very non-linear and branches off into a variety of different storylines based on what you choose to do. Sadly, this one never came out in the West, nor does it have an English fan translation online. I tried playing the Japanese version and didn't make it very far as the menu is very text-heavy. It's a shame really, as out of all the new games that I discovered when researching for this video, this was the one I was most interested in. Oh well, maybe one day. The last game we would get in 1997 would be Ninpin Manmaru on December 18th for the Sega Saturn. I believe that translates to Ninja Penguin. This one was developed by Tamtam and was based on an anime and manga series of the same name. It's one of the few 3D games for the console and is a pure platformer through and through. You can't attack enemies here, it's just jumping and maneuvering around various obstacles and levels. Controls can take a little bit getting used to, but graphically, I think there's a lot of charm in the bright colors and that early 3D look. As with many other games on this list, this one never officially got released outside of Japan, but a fan translation does exist online. Not that it's that text-heavy to begin with. The first game of 1998 would be Bust-A-Groove for the PlayStation on January 29th, or Bust-A-Move as it was known in Japan. However, that name was already taken everywhere else as for some reason they decided to localize the completely different series Puzzle Bobble as Bust-A-Move. This always confused me so much as a kid. I got the series mixed up all the time. Anyway, this one was only published by Enix in Japan, and is sort of like a rhythm game where you battle one-on-one against other quirky characters and dance-offs. Parappa the Rapper was a pretty big sleeper hit not too long before this one, so I guess it tried to ride that wave a bit. It was marketed as a hybrid of dancing and fighting games, but there's pretty much no fighting here, it's basically all rhythm. It's a pretty interesting game overall, with a lot of the 90s cheese and charm to say the least. On April 9th, Riven, the sequel to Myst, would come out for the Sega Saturn in Japan. Out of all the various releases this game had, Enix only published the Saturn version in Japan, so I'm not going to talk about this one too much. It's a graphic puzzle adventure game developed by Cyan Worlds and was really popular when it came out. I remember seeing ads for this game everywhere back in the day. I suppose the $10 million marketing budget probably helped with that. I never played this one too much, but I've always been curious about it. I think the visuals are beautiful and the atmosphere in general just looks really immersive. On June 25th, a soccer RPG would come out for the Sega Saturn. Yeah, sorry guys, I'm not even gonna attempt to pronounce this one. I don't think this ever got translated to English, so I don't know a whole lot about this one. Other than that, it's just an RPG involving soccer. Oh, and that it was made by Sega, I guess. I'm not a huge fan of soccer, but with that said, I think this game looks pretty interesting. The pre-rendered backgrounds when walking around look awesome and give me PS1 Final Fantasy vibes, so that's always a good thing. On July 30th, Eggs of Steel, Charlie's Excellent Adventure would come out for the PlayStation. This game was published by Enix, only in Japan actually, under the different title of Hello Charlie. It's a puzzle platformer where you play as the night watchman Egg Charlie as he tries to save his steel factory. The game has a really interesting graphical style with all of the pre-rendered backgrounds and whatnot. There's also a ton of cinematic FMVs, and they surprisingly look really good for the time. Well, not that surprising actually, as the company that made this game, Rhythm and Hue Studios, is normally a visual effects and animation company and has quite the catalog behind it. Seriously, their Wikipedia page is super impressive. They've even won Oscars for their work in movies like Life of Pi, and have even won various Emmys for their work in series like Game of Thrones. Yeah, pretty crazy stuff. I definitely didn't think to find all this out when I was looking into the company that made Charlie's Excellent Adventure. The game itself is just okay, but man, do some scenes look cool. On that same day of July 30th, Star Ocean: The Second Story would be released for the PlayStation. First of all, let me just say, I love this game. This is my favorite RPG in the entire video. In my opinion, it's hands down the best entry in the Star Ocean series, and a top 5 PS1 RPG. If you know how many classic RPGs the PS1 had, you know that's quite the compliment. Tri-Ace absolutely knocked it out of the park with this one. One of the biggest improvements I think was the inclusion of an overworld map this time, which just helps the scope of the world feel a lot bigger. Or worlds, I should say. They made full use of the console's capabilities as well, with the battle system moving to full 3D. Changes aside, the game is just polished to an outstanding degree. Backgrounds are gorgeous, Motoi Sakuraba's composition is excellent, battles are loads of fun, and the game just has tons of ambition overall. In addition to the private action system returning, along with optional characters that you can't recruit all in one playthrough, weapon customization is more fleshed out than ever with the inclusion of talents, and more importantly, there's 2 main characters you can choose at the start of the game, Claude or Reyna. The story doesn't necessarily change, but you do see it from a different perspective with conversations you wouldn't have seen otherwise, so that's pretty cool. There's also recruitable party members exclusive to that character's playthrough, which gives the game even more replayability. There's also over 80 possible endings. I remember seeing that as a big selling point, as it was even on the back of the case. Looking back in hindsight, it's pretty crazy to see how many ambitious systems they put into this game, and how they still managed to make them all work so well. Star Ocean: The Second Story was truly a game ahead of its time in all the best ways. I would love to eventually cover this game in a full retrospective. A month later, on August 27th, Astronoka would come out for the PlayStation. It was co-developed by Mumu and System Sakam and seems to be sort of like a space farm simulation game. I don't think it was ever translated to English, so I don't know a whole lot about it. It looks pretty quirky and out there though. The next month, on September 23rd, Itadaki Street Fortune King would be released for the PlayStation. Only in Japan, of course. Another party game in the long-running Tomcat System franchise. Not much else to say here. A couple days later, on September 25th, Dragon Quest Monsters would come out for the Game Boy Color, or Dragon Warrior Monsters as it was known in North America. This one was developed by Toes and was the first Dragon Quest game to be released in Europe. Pretty interesting it took them this long, considering the entire series is based on European medieval fantasy. Anyway, this one gets compared to Pokemon a lot as it came out pretty shortly after the popularity of Red, Blue, and Green, but in actuality, it's quite different. Plus, let's be real, Dragon Quest V was the first game to include recruitable monsters, so if anything, Pokemon copied it. At its core, Dragon Quest Monsters still plays more like a Dragon Quest game rather than a Pokemon game. Battles are your standard Dragon Quest turn-based fare where you can fight with up to 3 monsters on your team. There's a random chance for defeated monsters to join your party after battle, however the best way to build up your team is the breeding system. Every male and female monster can be breeded together, and this is how you get the real powerful ones. Again, this game did the whole breeding thing before Pokemon did, so who's the real clone here? As an overall game, Dragon Quest Monsters definitely has its charm, but it's just okay. It can get pretty repetitive after a while, but it's still a solid RPG in the Game Boy Color library.
彼女たちとの会話、不可解な行動、見つからない凶器、真実の行方はユーラシアエクスプレス殺人事件。
To finish off the year, Murder on the Eurasia Express would come out on November 26th for the PlayStation. This is a very interesting interactive movie and adventure game developed by System Sakam. The entire game is a live-action, full-motion video taking place over 2 real-time hours where you play as a private detective trying to solve a murder mystery on a train. It stars a bunch of J-pop idols along with various cameos from some figures in the gaming industry. As one would expect, this one did not make it out of Japan, and I don't think it has an English fan translation either. Moving on to the final year of the decade, Goo Goo Drops would come out for the PlayStation on January 28th. This one was developed by Produce and is sort of like a simulation game where you play as a caveman, just trying to live his life and progress onwards. It's hard to know exactly what this game entails as it was never released outside of Japan, and I don't think it ever got an English fan translation. From what I gathered online though, you collect a plethora of items that help you advance through the game, like an axe to cut down trees, for example. It looks pretty interesting. I like the bright, cartoonish graphics. On March 18th, another Produce game, Mystic Arc Mabaroshi Gakiju, would come out for the PlayStation. This was a sequel to Mystic Arc that was also not released in English, and I don't think has a fan translation either. Unlike the first game, which was an RPG, this one seemed to be more of an adventure game. The beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but to me, it's got a lot of that early 3D, rough around the edges charm, and I think some areas look quite good. If this one ever got translated, I would love to check it out. The next month, on April 15th, Busta Groove 2 would come out for the PlayStation. This one was also developed by Metro, which I forgot to mention when discussing the first game, and is pretty much just more of the same. Like the first game, this one is also pretty damn expensive in price these days. If you want a copy of the game, you're gonna have to bust a big move in your bank account, unfortunately. Please don't leave after that lame joke, I promise the video's almost over. On June 3rd, the extremely weird game Sagarajiri would come out on the PlayStation. This one was co-developed by Braindog and Nemesis, and I don't know, man. I'm kind of at a loss of words for this. The footage speaks for itself. Just let this bizarre, completely abstract, acid trip-like visuals take you on a ride for a bit. Wow, that was, certainly something. Gotta love Japan. On July 29th, Poppin' Tanks would be released for the PlayStation. This one was developed by Symbiote Systems and is like a one-on-one arena tank combat game. Think Twisted Metal, but one-on-one and bright, cheery anime graphics. It's probably not a game that's gonna blow you away, but it's pretty fun to mess around in. Seeing what all the various power-ups and weapons can do is always a good time. On that same day, Rakugaki Showtime would be released for the PlayStation. This one was developed by Treasure, and man, can we just take a moment to appreciate how amazing Treasure was? Easily one of the best developers from the 90s that gets a lot of love in certain circles, but still remains pretty overlooked among the broader gaming sphere. I would love to make a similar video about their company eventually. They approached all of their titles in really creative, artistic, refreshing ways, and Rakugaki Showtime is no exception. One look at this game and it's easy to see that. The hand-drawn, crayon-like aesthetic is super unique and something I've never really seen done in a video game before. I could say something similar about the gameplay as well. It's like a 3D combat arena fighter where you throw a lot of projectiles at your enemies. The biggest comparison would be the Power Stone series, just more of a focus on throwing. It almost kinda plays like dodgeball in that sense, just no dividing lines. Rakugaki Showtime never officially got released in English, but it's not that text heavy, so it's still pretty playable through alternative means. On September 15th, Torniko The Last Hope would come out for the PlayStation. This one was co-developed by Chunsoft and Matrix Software, and was a follow-up to their previous Dragon Quest Mystery Dungeon game on the Super Famicom. If you're wondering why I didn't mention that one earlier, it surprisingly wasn't published by Enix, rather Chunsoft instead. Anyway, this is basically just a mystery dungeon roguelike set in the Dragon Quest universe, where you assume the role of Torniko the Merchant from Dragon Quest IV. Yeah, not the likely hero you would expect, but he was pretty popular in Japan and probably resonated a lot with the older crowd. On the contrary, 10-year-old me always passes by at EB Games as I thought he looked stupid on the cover art. At the time, I wanted your typical spiky-haired teenager saving the world or some dark edgy stuff, and this was definitely not it. Being an adult now though, I get the appeal. This is not a game for everyone, but the ones it does appeal to, there's a good time to be had here. The 2D graphics were criticized a lot back then for being a little outdated, but I think they hold up pretty well now. It's a charming game for sure. On September 23rd, ports of the first two Dragon Quest games would be released on the Game Boy Color, or Dragon Warrior as it was still known in the West. Again, I'm not going to talk about these ones too much considering they originally came out in the 80s, and I'm just going to save it for the series retrospective instead. This was my introduction to the series though, so I have a lot of nostalgic memories with this version. I still remember the day I found this at Toys R Us and took that little paper slip back to the back counter and exchanged it for the actual game. Simpler times. On October 21st, Planet Laika would come out for the PlayStation. This one was co-developed by Quintet and Zack, and it's a pretty weird game. It was described as being an RPG, but it's really more of an adventure game, I'd say. And a very trippy adventure game at that. Essentially, you play as a dog-like human by the name of Laika as you take a trip to Mars and have to deal with your multiple personality disorder through a variety of super trippy, completely abstract visuals and characters. It's very much a surrealist horror game. There's so much bizarre imagery that's gonna leave you wondering like, what the hell is going on? True nightmare fuel in some cases. Between that, the deep conversations that are supposed to make you question your existence, and the perfectly fitting ambient music, and you have an incredibly unique, unsettling atmosphere that is unmatched. I can assure you, you've never played a game like this before. This one never officially got released in the West, but a fan translation was released not too long ago. So yeah, if you want to explore this creatively creepy world and have nightmares for a week, check it out. My friends, we are finally here. The last game that Enix published in the 90s. The big question though, did they go out on a high note, or, well, you tell me.
Valkyrie Profile, Enix.
On December 22nd, Valkyrie Profile would be released for the PlayStation. Yeah, it was a high note. Valkyrie Profile was developed by Tri-Ace and absolutely kicks ass. In this game, you play as Lyneth, a Valkyrie who travels throughout Midgard trying to collect the fallen souls of soldiers to aid her in the Battle of Ragnarok, which is basically a battle to decide the fate of the world. The story is heavily influenced by Norse mythology, however it does take some liberties, so if you're a Norse mythology buff, don't go in expecting 100% accuracy. What you can expect though is an incredibly ambitious and unique game of which no other kind like it exists on the PlayStation. Unlike pretty much any other PS1 RPG, exploration plays out like a 2D side-scroller and has you doing a lot of platforming and puzzle solving in dungeons. Battles aren't random as you can see the enemies on screen. When you touch an enemy though, it transitions you to a turn-based battle screen, where each of your 4 buttons correspond with the character attacking. By timing out things well enough, you can create a lot of combos between characters and even juggle enemies in the air. It's a surprisingly in-depth system that is quite a bit deeper than it appears on the surface. In between dungeons, you fly throughout the world as Lyneth, trying to locate these fallen soldiers before their untimely demise. You'll then get to witness the events that led up to their death, and yeah, it's a pretty grim and depressing game, to be honest. As a kid, it was a little too depressing for me, but as an adult, I've come to appreciate it much more now. The overarching narrative isn't necessarily the strong point, but these individual character stories are really good. What's also really good is the sprite work. Man, do these look awesome. Easily some of the best on the entire PlayStation. There's also a lot of voice acting for the characters, and it's actually not bad for the time.
Platina, we've got to run. Come now, hurry.
For today's standards, it would be okay, but for back then, it was definitely a lot better than its counterparts with other PS1 RPGs. Really, my only gripe with the game is that it has multiple endings, and in order to see the best ending, you have to follow some very strict requirements. Like, unless you're playing with a guide, it's pretty much impossible you're gonna stumble upon it naturally in your first playthrough. On the flip side, between this and all of the variety of characters you can recruit, some locked behind specific difficulty settings, it creates a lot of replayability to say the least. Unfortunately, due to the low print run of the game and it just being amazing, it goes for quite the hefty price tag these days. Notoriously, one of the most expensive games on the entire system. That fact makes me even sadder that my instruction manual got absolutely wrecked from a water leak in the basement a while back. Like, look at this thing, it's pretty much sealed shut and feels like cardboard. Only a few of our PS1 RPGs got damaged by that water leak, and of course this was one of them. Truly a tragic day. Maybe not as tragic as some of these characters' days though. I guess life could always be worse. Well, that's it. Every game Enix published in the 90s. I knew this was gonna be a long video, but man, probably underestimated the scope just a little bit. However, a lot of people just know Enix for series like Dragon Quest, so I wanted to include everything along with their more obscure side that some people may not be as familiar with. If there's someone out there who already knew every single game on this list, then, well, I humbly applaud you for your gaming knowledge. Truly impressive. For everyone else, this video should have made it pretty clear what made Enix in the 90s so damn special. From tradition to ambition, they had it all. While there are some great games we unfortunately missed out on back in the day, I am grateful for the ones that Enix did localize over here, as some of them are some of my favorite gaming memories ever. Thanks a bunch, Enix. Of course, Enix would continue on for a few more years until their merger with Square in 2003, but that's a tale for another time. Until then, thanks for watching everyone. This is Corbin from Gaming Productions. Have a great day.